beforehand, I was afraid of all the crazy countries in the world, or the deserts, or the mountains, or the snow and ice. Um, but having finished the journey now, I can say that the hardest part of it wasn't all those things. The hardest part was waking up in my warm, comfortable bed at home in England, having a nice big breakfast with my mum and dad and brother, and then saying goodbye to them all, getting on the bike and pedaling off down the street. That moment was without doubt the hardest thing I did in the journey. But to tell you then the story of the journey, from there I pedaled from England, crossed over to France, and then cycled through Europe to Istanbul and Turkey, through the Middle East through Syria, Lebanon, Jordan into Egypt, and then down the east side of Africa through Egypt into Sudan, crossing the Nubian desert there, the mountains of Ethiopia, across the equator in Kenya, and all the way down to Cape Town. My plan before I began was quite loose on details, so I hadn't really considered how I would get across the oceans. But I think I just assumed that I would take an aeroplane. But as I was riding down Africa, I was starting to learn to think a bit bigger and be a bit bolder and braver with my ideas. So I had the idea, wouldn't it be great if I could somehow get around the world without leaving the surface of the planet? What if I could cross the ocean by boat? So I got very excited about this idea, although I had no idea how to do it. But in the end, I managed to find a sailing boat to sail across the Atlantic Ocean. And then I cycled from the very bottom of South America, from Patagonia, right the way up through South America, up into the US, up the west coast of America to Alaska. Finally, all I had to do was find another boat across the Pacific Ocean and then cycle through Siberia. In the winter time, temperatures were down to minus 40 degrees for those 3 months, through Russia, down Japan, China, right the way through Central Asia, all the stans, back into Europe and back home to England for a nice cup of tea.
Wow. Your mom must have been happy to see you back there, Alastair.
Well, I was away for over 4 years, so the journey took 4 years and 3 months to do. I cycled 73,000 kilometers, it's 46,000 miles through 60 different countries, and the whole trip cost me about £7,000, which you can translate into the currency of your choice at pre or post Brexit exchange rates. But whichever way you look at it, it was a very cheap way to spend 4 years of adventure. And of course, yeah, it was fantastic to get back and see my family again. I hadn't seen my family for over 4 years by the time I got home. But of course, typical parents, they get home, they welcome home their son, and then of course, then they start worrying. So they say, "Ooh, what next? When are you going to get a proper job?" So real life is always chasing on. You finish one project, and all that really does is put you at the beginning of whatever is next. So you're always...
Are they still asking you to get a proper job?
Well, at least at the moment, they're not asking me to get a proper haircut. I've had my coronavirus haircut. I wanted to model myself on you, Eric. So I've finally got a sensible haircut, which they like. And finally, they're happy with my job now. I'm writing books. I'm paying my taxes, and I think finally they're pleased that I'm making a living out of doing what I love. So it's come good in the end.
You rode around the planet on a bicycle in 4 years, and what lessons would you say that what takeaways from that journey that you could share with us today?
Well, I still feel that I'm processing a lifetime's lessons from that, but I think something that's relevant to us today in terms of the coronavirus, but also this conversation with all these countries popping up in the chat, was just how the world felt. This sounds a bit like a hippie thing, I feel, when I say it, but rather than it feeling like lots of countries together, I really felt that I was just cycling around one world rather than a collection of separate nations. And before I began, so many people were warning me of the dangers. Don't go to this part of the world, they'll all kill you there. Don't go to this part of the world, it's really dangerous. But as anyone who's traveled a lot will know, I just met kindness pretty much everywhere I went. I felt kind, kindness, and I felt welcomed in every single culture I went to. And I think that's an important thing for us to remember in this time when hopefully the world needs to be trying to work together. So that was one very important thing. I think the other thing that really stands out for me is that I knew I wanted a big adventure. I knew I wanted to go for a long bike ride, but I didn't really think I could actually cycle around the world. That's a stupid thing to say, especially if you've never done it before. And I'm not an athlete at all. I'm not a super strong guy. I'm just a normal person. So perhaps it seemed like a ridiculous goal. But I did it. To my great surprise, I made it right the way around the world. Something which, for the first 2.5 years of the trip, I never actually thought I was going to make it to the end. So I suppose that the lesson I learned from that was that I am capable of far more than I realized. And I don't say that as a boastful thing. I'm sure that applies for every single one of us. If we do two things. One, we have to dare ourselves to come up with a really big, audacious challenge. And then two, perhaps the second hardest part of it, is daring ourselves to get out the front door and begin, and trusting that things will follow from that. One thing's absolutely certain is if you don't get out your front door and begin, then you won't succeed. There's a good chance for at least 2 years of the trip that I might well have failed, but if I hadn't set off that first morning.
Yeah, you met that you said that you met a lot of people and were kind of impressed by that. And Diego has a question on if anyone stands out. He says, who was the most interesting person you met and why?
Oh, if I could have had one superhero power cycling around the world, it wouldn't have been really strong legs or anything like that. It would have been the ability to speak to every person I met in their language. So many different people and languages I met, and being British, I'm ashamed to say that my language skills are pathetic, like most of my country folk. The people that fascinated me were people I met, for example, in the Ethiopian highlands. I hadn't seen anyone for hours and hours and hours, high up in the mountains, a rocky landscape, and suddenly you meet a man with a herd of goats. And I wish I could have just shared his story of his life. So there was all these sort of people that I met whose lives just so different from mine. I was completely fascinated by, but sometimes with a communication barrier. In terms of people who I could actually have a good conversation with, I met a fantastic man in Arizona in America called Tom Whitaker. I didn't know him at all. He is a first amputee to climb Mount Everest, and he very kindly turned up at one of the talks I was giving along the way, and then invited me to visit his house. And at that time, I'd never met anyone who had climbed Everest, so I was completely in awe of this man, and I was still quite close to giving up my journey. So he made me drink a lot of Guinness at his house, and basically gave me a lot of encouragement to keep going and to not give up. So that was a really inspiring meeting to have the chance to spend time with him.
We're getting a lot of questions, but some of them will be addressed in the topics as well. But an interesting one is, when did you start believing that you could actually do it?
Well, that anecdote I just said was in the very early days of me reaching the USA, and I was starting to think over halfway. It was always nice to think that it was shorter to keep pedaling around the world that way than to turn around and cycle back home that way. So that was a good part. But there was one moment that really made me think, I have to do this now. And that was after cycling all the way through Europe, Africa, and right the way up South America. I got to a place called Cartagena in Colombia. And I decided then that this was enough. I'd been cycling for over 2 years. I'd cycled Europe, Africa, and South America. It was really hard. Enough was enough, and I could go home and feel proud. And I decided that I was happy with that decision. But before I flew home, of course, I needed to get my end of journey photograph. And I wanted to get that at the ocean to show that I'd completed South America. So I went to the ocean, which happened to be the sailing club in Cartagena. That was the easiest access I had to the ocean. And I walked down the long wooden jetty thing where all the boats are, right to the very end, took my end of continent photo, and then turned around thinking, right, I'm going to go and book my flight and go back to England. And as I was walking down that wooden track, someone called out to me on the boat, an American guy, saying, "Hey, are you looking for a lift to Panama?" And one of the reasons that I'd decided that would be the end point is that it's impossible to get from Colombia through to Central America by land. The Darien Gap blocks that, and it seemed like there was no way to pass. And suddenly this man is calling out to me that he's going to give me a lift on his sailing boat. And this was just such a crazy coincidence that I just had to say, yeah, I'll come on your boat. And from then on, I just thought, right, I'm more than halfway. I can finish this.
That's a great story. Cycling started you off, but I know we have talked before. You've been on some very different adventures ever since. And one that called my attention as well was the Marathon des Sables that you did. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the Marathon des Sables they call themselves the toughest running race in the world. It's a 150-mile, 240-kilometer ultramarathon through the Sahara Desert in Morocco. It's a stage race. It's spread over about a week, and you run a section each day. You have to carry on the trip everything you need, all of your food, all of your sleeping equipment, and they issue you with a ration of water along the way. So it's an exercise in running a long way, dealing with the heat, managing the constraints of rationed food and rationed water, and learning to pace yourself. I think if you do a race like that, by the time you get to the start line, you're obviously fit from all your training, and the temptation is just to set off fast. You're finally off, but I kept having to bear in mind that I had 150 miles to go, and that the best way to get to the end quickly was by beginning very slowly. Some of the challenges involved in that, well, the heat was the worst part. It was over 50 degrees Celsius, which for a pale-skinned English guy was quite a challenge. So dealing with the heat, dealing with your feet, when your feet get that hot, you get sand in your shoes, people's feet get shredded into some horrible, disgusting blisters, and then rationing, managing your food and your sleep over those days. On the final day, the day before the end, I broke my foot. I stood awkwardly on a rock and broke a bone in my foot. So I had to finish the event with a broken foot, which sounds a little bit crazy, but one of the joys of that event was to be sharing the desert with 800 other crazy people who were all crossing the finish lines with their bodies broken and limping and hobbling along. So I wasn't particularly out of the ordinary and suffering there. But I really enjoyed that experience compared to, say, cycling trip I did or rowing the Atlantic that I did, that it was me on my own, but with 800 people around me. And that was a very different experience to the bicycle journey.
So to what extent, when you row the Atlantic or when you run the desert, to what extent as a solo adventurer that you started out, has that contributed to your journey?
Sorry, I was just writing something then. Could you repeat?
Okay, good. No, you said rowing the Atlantic, you do in a team. You just said you shared the desert in that ultra marathon with 800 people, whereas the cycling was more of a solo experience. So what has that taught you about sharing an adventure like that with others? What insight in people has it given you?
So over time, I've come to try to alternate a journey by myself, a journey with other people. Journey by myself, a journey with other people. And the reason for that is that there are advantages and disadvantages of both. Before I cycled around the world, I tried to find a friend to do it with me. I didn't want to go alone. I was a bit too afraid to go alone, but nobody would come with me. So I had to go on my own. And looking back now, I'm very grateful for that. A journey by yourself, if you succeed, it's because of you. If you fail, it's because of you. And I really liked that clarity there. There were no excuses. I couldn't hide behind any excuses. It's just me out there. So a journey by yourself is very much a lesson into what's going on in your head. And usually I don't always like what I see. You're not necessarily very proud of yourself when you're suffering out in a wild place. Journeys with other people are much more fun. You share the experience, you laugh with the people, and then in the future when you get home, you can go to a bar with them and have a beer and remember these experiences. So it's a nice shared experience. Of course, is that you can't be so selfish. You have to deal not only with your weaknesses, but the other person's weaknesses. And so it's very much a different approach you have to have. And I really like both of them. But I think one example of the difference is that when I was cycling on my own, I could be really tough on myself. It was just stop being pathetic, get on your bike and ride. And I just had this mentality of trying to push away my weaknesses. When I was rowing the Atlantic Ocean, so that's crossing 3,000 miles of ocean in a small rowing boat there were 4 people on that rowing boat. We were very much 4 of us on a very small boat in the middle of a very big ocean. And that to work successfully, you had to be right to other people, concerned about them and trying your best always to help the other people. And I think though that is quite an obvious thing, that I think if you're doing a trip like that, you need to be kind and caring. What we did on the trip though, which I'd never done before and which has helped me hugely in my life since, was not only kindness, but also accepting kindness, receiving kindness. An example of that, I'm rowing up in the middle of the night, feeling seasick, feeling terrible, really weak, suffering. And one of the other people in the crew says, "Alastair, you look terrible. You look like you're weak and sick. I think you should go and rest for a little while." The instinct in myself from the cycling journey would be to say, no, I'm not weak. I'm tough. I'm strong. I'll show you, and just keep on rowing until I probably collapsed. That's often been my mentality, is to not admit any weakness. But on the rowing trip, what we did was to say, yes, thank you. I do feel really, really bad now. I'm really having a hard time. Thank you for offering to help, and I accept that. And then you go into the little cabin and get some sleep. And what this does is several things. One, it just makes the boat go quicker because it's a team effort to get you across the ocean. So it helps everybody. It obviously helps me because I get to rest. And I know that at some point in the journey, I'll be able to repay that to my friend by helping him out when he's having a bad time. So I think a lot of people who are quite hardworking, driven, successful sort of people find it hard to admit that they're finding things hard and accepting help. So that's been one of the best lessons I've learned from all of my adventures.
All right. You mentioned earlier when the toughest part when you started a cycling journey was getting out of the door. And I know you work with a concept that you call the Doorstep mile. And I think that is an interesting thing to share with the audience today.
Yeah, the Doorstep mile is a small phrase that's helped me a lot in life. So in all my years of doing big expeditions, I would get to the start line, and instead of feeling excited about this big new project, I just want to cry or give up and go home and watch television. I was just scared. It seemed too hard. I was going to fail. I can't do this. And I'd be at the start line of this wonderful journey, just really unhappy and doubting myself. And I used to be really hard on myself about this. I used to think that just meant I was pathetic or not the right sort of person for expeditions, and I just wasn't for me. And then I learned a Norwegian phrase, which Norwegian is Doorstep, and it translates into English as the doorstep mile. And what the doorstep mile phrase means is that the longest mile of any journey is stepping out of your front door and beginning. And I loved this phrase because it summed up everything that I was struggling with in my own journeys, finding it so hard just to take the first little step to begin. And once I had a phrase to describe this, I found it very, very helpful now. And I use it now in everything I do. And so not just adventures, but for example, writing a book. I write books, and writing a book is a hard thing to do. You sit there with a blank computer screen, and then you go and have coffee, and you come back to the blank computer screen, and again, it's just too difficult. So you go and check Twitter, and this continues and continues. But the doorstep mile has taught me that in order to write a book, all I really need to do is just write one word. I can just write the beginning. And then you just start to type, and what you're writing is, of course, rubbish, but over time that will get better. So thinking of the big project, and then finding the first tiny little action you can take today to get you out of the front door and beginning. I found that really helpful, both in adventures and in working life.
So when you talk about big projects, could you say that your life is now a sequence of big expeditions?
No, definitely not. And not only because of coronavirus, and we're all locked up these days, but my life has very much changed from the years of big expeditions, and actually it has been becoming smaller and smaller adventures, for two main reasons. One, I started a family, and once you have a couple of little kids, it's quite hard to disappear on your bicycle for 4 years. That's not really an option. So I had to find a way to fit adventure around my new life. The other thing, though, was that after about 10 years of expeditions and books and talks and things, I noticed that there's quite an audience of people who love the idea of big adventures, but who are not actually doing them themselves. So I just asked myself why this was, and the answer, of course, is real life. Most people don't have the time to go and walk across India. Most people don't necessarily have the money or want to spend the money on crossing the ice cap in Greenland. So how then can you still get some sense of adventure without going all the way around the world? So I thought about the adventures that I'd loved and what felt important and meaningful in them, and I tried to find ways to find them close to home. And the way I did that was I looked at what stops people having adventures, and then tried to find something you could still do. And I did this by making my adventures smaller and smaller, to the point where I started calling them micro adventures. And a quick example of a micro adventure might be that we have the 9-to-5 working life, and that's an important part of life, but perhaps it gets a little bit in the way of adventures. So we can either get sad about the 9-to-5, or we can get excited about the opportunity of the 5-to-9, the hypothetical, theoretical 16 hours of freedom that we have every day, at least in normal situations. So, for example, one thing I've started doing is I write my book all day till 5 o'clock, and then in the evening, put the kids to bed. My wife is an accountant. She works for a big accountancy firm. She thinks adventures are stupid, so she likes to stay at home, watch Netflix and drink wine. So I put the kids to bed, and then I wave goodbye to my wife, put my rucksack on, and just head out to the nearest hill just near where I live, just outside London. Climb a hill, sleep on top of the hill for the night, turn off the phone, moon, stars, bird song. You wake up at sunrise. You've had a wilderness adventure experience, run back down the hill, back home again in time for breakfast, back to my desk for more book writing at 9 a.m. So rather than seeing the constraints, the obstacle, the problem of the 9-to-5, try to see the opportunities of what adventures might still be possible. And I think that's a great thing that we can try and do at the moment. There's so much crazy stuff going on at the moment. We can either get really bogged down by the constraints, or we can try to choose to think, what opportunities are there for things to change in a positive way?
Also, reading some questions here in the chat box. Did the media know you were cycling across the world, and how did this affect your journey?
The media didn't know I was cycling around the world. It's just me, my mum, and I started a blog, and I started having a newsletter from that. But no one really knew. It was very much just a journey that I did in the way that felt important to me. And now time has changed. Now adventure is now my job, and therefore adventure storytelling is my job, and that very much changes the adventure experiences. Not sometimes for the worse, sometimes for the better, but when you're thinking about your adventure being a story you can tell, it definitely changes the perspective on things in good ways and in bad ways. But actually, I love the storytelling, writing, photography, film. So generally, I see that side as adding to my experiences.
There's another question here that says, I think we talked about your micro adventures rather than just the big adventures, but still, I think people are curious to know, when are you leaving again?
Yeah, I think we're all.
And perhaps there is something, Alastair, is it, in this stage of life when you're a father of young kids, there might be something that you can do now, but there might be some things on your bucket list as well for further down the road.
Asking the question, when are we going to leave again, aren't we, at the moment? Two answers to this. One is forgetting coronavirus. I'm not really looking to leave again at the moment. I've 2 young kids. I'm trying to give up flying for environmental reasons, and I'm teaching myself, therefore, to love what I have, to see the adventure around where I live and the wild places around where I live, and to realize that if you explore deeply enough, then what you have close to home is more than enough. In terms of right now, during lockdown, I'm getting my adventure hit at the moment by running every single street around where I live. And this has been a brilliant exercise in learning to pay attention and to find the opportunities. So I've been running down streets and back streets, up and all these wiggling around streets. And an example is that, and I'm amazed to say this, I've been living in this house for 10 years, and I found 400 meters away from my home a street that I've never been down before. And I was amazed at that. So that means that even now I'm exploring without being able to go anywhere.
And speaking about exploring, Alastair, if you would place yourself a few centuries back in time, and you could truly be an explorer with no insight what the rest of the world holds, where would you set sail to?
Oh, I often, when I was cycling around the world, I was often really envious of the adventurers who arrived in Egypt without knowing the pyramids existed and suddenly seeing these things, or Hiram Bingham first seeing Machu Picchu through the jungle. And I think it's a sad, it's not sad, that's not the right word. I think maybe it's a sad thing for adventure and travel that these days we already know what we will find before we get there. And I try to make myself do as much preparation as necessary to stay safe and to succeed. And then beyond that, just to trust to the universe and see what will happen. So, for example, I walked across southern India a few years ago, just from the coast of Tamil Nadu to the coast of Kerala. And I was going to follow a river. I found a river, one of the 7 holy rivers on Wikipedia, called the Kaveri River. I flew out there and I deliberately did no more planning than that. I did 0 research about this river, so to try and allow some surprise and wonder and mystery into my journey. Sorry, I didn't actually answer your question. So if to go back in time, what I would have loved to have done was to be one of the explorers who sailed south in search of Antarctica when they didn't know if it even existed or not. And to see those enormous icebergs and the deep, deep south of the planet, I think that would be my dream exploring. Although I'm not sure I would have been brave enough to do it because they were pretty crazy guys.
Do you think you have to be brave to get out of your comfort zone? And you know, everyone has a different comfort zone, of course, but does the word comfort zone still apply to you, or have you gone beyond that?
I think comfort zone is very, very relevant to my life, and I think getting out of it is a very frightening thing to do, much more frightening actually than climbing a mountain or crossing a desert, if that's the sort of thing you do. I noticed that a few years ago, I noticed that I'd now been doing expeditions for so many years that I was good at them. I knew what to expect. I knew they'd probably work out fine, and that actually to continue cycling, hiking, camping, that sort of thing, it sounds adventurous, but it wasn't. That was me in my comfort zone. And if I wanted to get out of my comfort zone, I needed to find a different way to scare myself, to be in the unknown, to risk failure. And the way I found that was I decided to follow the route of an old book I loved called As I Walked Out One Midsummer Morning, about a young guy in the 1930s walking through Spain playing his violin. It's a beautiful book, and I'd always wanted to do that journey myself, but I can't play the violin, and performing music in public or karaoke or dancing is my biggest fear. I hate that sort of thing. So I thought, this is it. This scares me. This feels like an adventure. So I turned up in Spain with no money at all, no credit card, and I had a month to survive walking 800 kilometers through Spain with only my musical skills to pay for it. And I'm terrible. If you look on YouTube, actually, there's a video called My Midsummer Morning, which is the story of this journey. You can see how bad I am. But the first time I stood up to play a small, beautiful little Spanish village, got out my violin, was so frightening. I realized actually that morning that it was the most afraid I had been since the day I set off to row the Atlantic Ocean. And I think that's really interesting, that fear and comfort zone could be either rowing the Atlantic, or it could be standing up and playing the violin in a small Spanish plaza. And that's, the violin trip turned out to be one of the best adventures of my entire life. And the adventure was nothing to do with walking over the mountains and camping out under the stars. The adventure was standing up in small towns, playing my violin, and just being honest to the world. So I know I'm not very good, but I'm trying my best, and this is all I've got. It was a really great adventure.
Okay, like you know, if adventures can be as big and small, and it can also relate to what you're good at or where your comfort zone ends. But right now, everyone is in a certain stage of lockdown in their own countries. What would you say to people that still look for a way to find some adventure in their daily life while their movement is so restricted nowadays?
Well, I know this is a hard time for everyone, and we're having difficult times in different ways. So I'll say that first. The second thing, though, is that we always have a choice. Every day we have a choice to look for the opportunities, the good things, the possibilities, or to get depressed and sad about the bad things. And I'm sure there are, well, so I'll talk for myself. 99% of the world is having a harder time right now than me. So every day I get up and I think, oh no, I hate this virus, it's awful. And one of the lucky ones, and I go and have a freezing cold shower, because if you have a freezing cold shower, the rest of the day is then good after that. And I try and see what opportunities I have. So I've been trying to ask myself questions like, why have I done things this way for the last 10, 20 years? I can't do that now. What can I do that's different? Why have I always had this habit? I can't do it now. Can I do something differently? So I found it an amazing opportunity for trying to look at my normal life in very different ways, and to try and see what opportunities there are. And I've been getting really excited about how my work might change, about how my writing might change, about how my adventure message might change. So I hope that from my point of view, that what will come out of this is more local adventures. So people exploring closer to home, appreciating the things that they have closer to home, and actually just appreciating nature more, getting out in whatever amount you're allowed to do, getting out and just spending some time in nature. That's an important thing to do every day, but particularly so in a stressful time like this.
So you're spending more time at home. You have two small kids. Your wife's an accountant, you said. But of course, family life changes your perspective on things. So many of the people in today's audience will have a family. To what extent do you involve your family in your adventures, or to what extent they are a driver or perhaps a limitation to what you can do?
There's certainly a limitation in terms of the big adventures that I used to do, and it took me quite a few years actually to embrace a new way of life, rather than being sad and frustrated that my old way of life was compromised and I wasn't as free and adventurous as I used to be. It took me time, longer than I wish it had taken. It took me time to acknowledge that one thing has finished, what can now begin? Sleeping out in the garden, making little campfires, climb trees, daring them to climb trees. So that has definitely changed as I try now to see adventure through their eyes. My wife's an accountant. She has a very different approach to me to risk. So that's very interesting. Two very different ways of trying to raise and nurture children. There is, of course, no correct solution, but it's certainly made me question that more. And then I think the final thing I'd say is that I feel now a real pressure on myself to try and live a life that sets an example I'm proud of to them. So in my mind, that means trying to live adventurously in my work, in my adventures, in my relationship with them and friends and family, and just trying to be optimistic, positive, and try and dare them to dream nice and big, because they can achieve a lot, but they don't necessarily believe that. So trying to encourage them that they can achieve more than they think they can is high on my agenda.
So you asked them to dream big. So sooner or later they will come, because they've seen your pictures, they know what you're talking about in your shed. Sooner or later they will knock your door and say, "Daddy, it's time for a big adventure." So what would you what kind of adventure would you dream of taking your kids on?
Yeah, I've resisted the temptation to drag them up big mountains and off on huge character building expeditions, because, as you say, I want them to ask to come. I want them to choose to opt in, rather than it just being another hellish character building weekend with Dad. So I think the best adventure I've ever done in my life was getting on a bicycle, putting a tent on the back, pedaling away from my front door and having a look around. And I think whether you do that with a young kid for just 20 kilometers from home, or whether you start to cycle further, I think that is definitely the best way I've ever explored the world and learned about myself. So I'd be encouraging them to do it as well. I'm sure that when the time comes for them when they're teenagers and planning some sort of adventures off into the world on their own, I know then I will be torn between half of me saying, yes, go have adventures, and then probably another half of me saying, no, don't leave, stay here, stay safe. So I'm sure I will have these challenges to come.
I also want to encourage the people to type in any questions they might have related to anything that we discussed about, or perhaps sharing your own desire for adventure, or what you want to achieve, or specific advice you would like to ask Alastair.
there's one question I liked about what is the book that has changed your way of thinking? And I read a lot of travel and adventure books, so they were an early influence in lots of my decisions in life. But a book that I read probably about once a year is it's not about travel. It's called Man's Search for Freedom by Viktor Frankl, and I highly recommend everyone who's having a difficult time now reads that, because it's about the Holocaust, but actually in a surprisingly cheerful and uplifting way. And I just read that again. I was feeling it this week. I was thinking, oh no, coronavirus, my life's so unfair. So I read a bit of Viktor Frankl, and that set me on the straight again. So it's a surprisingly positive book, and I think a useful one to read.
Yep, I didn't see all there were some questions already, so I will read the other. In light of the COVID-19 and reduced traveling, we are seeing a trend whereby companies in our sector will likely be prioritizing supplies and trade with local and regional partners. By going more local, predictable, and arguably less inclined to take risks, is there still room for some adventurous thinking here?
Well, I'm out of my depth here because there are lots of words in that sentence that I don't understand that come from someone who's got a proper job, Simon. So I think I would just throw that question back to you, Simon, in that you know your sector, you know your work, you know the way things have always done. But now imagine, well, we are ripping up the sheet of paper to completely begin again and ask yourself, what would be an adventurous way of going local? How can we go local in a way that our rivals haven't thought of or don't dare do, and try to do it that way? I apologize, that's a real politician's answer, but I think this is a time for just beginning with a clean piece of paper and daring ourselves to build it up from there. What would you add to that, Eric? You should be able to give a much better answer than me to that.
I like the politician's answer. You know, I don't have to take any sides.
Okay. Yeah.
You know, but what I do like about your story in general is that, you know, when you go on an adventure or when you go on a trip, you have to rethink. You cannot really meticulously plan every day, because every day something will change. Every day will be different, and perhaps different from what you expected. So we constantly have to adjust to a changing environment. And sometimes that environment changes faster than we expected. And then I think you will truly see, like Darwin says, who's going to survive, who's going to do better, who's going to thrive in these circumstances. But you need a kind of a flexible and open mindset to be able to be ready for that.
Yeah, absolutely. When I set off to cycle around the world, my plan was to cycle from England to Australia via India and via beautiful Afghanistan. And I'd done all my careful planning. I'd got visas for Iran. I'd got my visas for Pakistan. I had my huge Himalayan winter jackets, and off I went. All sorted. Nothing could stop me. And then the 9/11 attacks happened in New York. The whole world went crazy. Perhaps that's one of the last times the world went crazy. And suddenly my carefully planned scenic route through Afghanistan no longer seemed to be such a good idea as war started. So then I found myself, instead of cycling to Australia, suddenly turning right for Africa, having to quickly ship home all of my Himalayan winter clothes, buy myself some shorts and a sun hat, and try and work out how the heck I was going to get a visa for Sudan, Angola, Congo. And the way I had to plot the visa struggle was I always had to try and work out that it's like a puzzle. I'm going this way. I need to get a visa for this country, but if they refuse me, I need to make sure I can get through this country or this country. So trying to always work out that the best case scenario is this, but if it fails, I have to have these other options so that my journey can just about continue. In the end, I actually was only refused visas for a handful of countries, but it was always quite a juggling trying to plot my way through that. So I never did cycle to Australia as planned, and who knows, my journey might have turned out better, it might have turned out worse. I had no idea. All we can say is that it turned out interestingly, and I think that's all we can ever have. May you live in interesting times.
I would ask you as well, Alastair, to look at the question. We've got quite a few of those. I think we also have some bike enthusiasts because someone's asking what kind of bike you use during your trip.
I used a fairly simple bike for two reasons. One, it was the bike I already had and I didn't have much money. But two, it's good to have something that's simple for a journey like that. You have to imagine if you break down in the middle of nowhere, can you fix it? So I didn't want suspension or clip-in pedals or titanium or carbon fiber. It needed to be simple. So I had a steel mountain bike, and I had steel because if that breaks anywhere, you can find someone to weld it. And that was fortunate because the frame of the bike snapped in the middle of the desert in Sudan, and I had to walk through the desert for a few days pushing the bike until I found a little village. And in the village was a man who, he had two jobs. He was the village baker, but he also made beds. So he had a welding torch and he could fix my bike. So I had a steel mountain bike, slightly modified with a rack so you could carry the bags. And I had two big bags on the back, two on the front, and a little handlebar bag as well.
And so another practical guy, but it might have been related. You might have answered by welding your bike, but someone's asking, what was the best survival hack that you learned?
The best survival hack I learned cycling around the world was to smile when you do not feel like smiling. So when you meet some annoying policeman who's trying to rip you off, or you get to some border and they say, oh, you don't have the correct stamp, or you meet someone who's looking like they might rob you, whenever you're feeling angry, smile instead. And I think that definitely helps with a lot of situations. So trying to always just, whatever you're thinking in your head, smile. That's the most useful thing I had on that trip.
Is that your British DNA that helped you there?
Oh, no, I think British people are quite grumpy, aren't we?
Okay. Another question, what was the biggest paradigm that you experienced or was forced to make?
The biggest
paradigm shift, I guess it is, right?
Well, I think probably it was discovering very early on that I was not the strong, heroic, brave explorer that I had imagined to be. I set off on that trip looking for a great adventure, and actually I just found myself to be really out of my depth and weak and not nearly as tough as I thought. So I had to start approaching the adventures from humility rather than trying to conquer the world. It was a much more approach of trying to be humble and learning to be grateful for getting through this day and trying my best to just ask for help along the way. Yeah, I think trying to go off on a big adventure makes you realize that you're actually very small. And I think that's a good thing to realize from time to time.
Yes, it is, yeah. Another question is, in your adventures, have you ever experienced, seen or felt God's presence? And it could also perhaps in a broader sense be like, did you have any religious or spiritual experience during your trip?
When I set off first trip, I was at this age of curiosity where I was really interested in religion in general, and I'd had quite a Christian upbringing, going to church a lot. So I was really interested in that side of the journey. Then I arrived in the Middle East, and I spent a few months cycling through Muslim part of the world, and on this changing of religions, went to different continents, different parts of the world. So I came home actually not having felt any of God's presence really, and it made me far less religious at all. However, I did feel a huge amount of the present, just a wonder at the world. So I came to be far more awestruck by nature, by the universe, and by our tiny little blue dot in the middle of the universe. So I got the big sense of bigness and our special place in that, but without any actual official religion connotations to it by the end.
All right. I take another question. Who were your childhood heroes?
My childhood heroes were all from the world of sport, really. When I grew up, I was dreaming of being a professional soccer player or a professional cricket player. all those sort of things. But I realized very early on, age about 10, that I had no talent at all, and that was not going to happen. And I actually only discovered adventurers when I was about 17 or 18. It was about the time when I should have been studying hard to get good grades to get into university that I started to discover explorers like Ranulph Fiennes, Captain Scott, and reading those sort of books made me think, wow, this is the big sort of adventure I want. It's time for me to leave my home in Yorkshire and go do some crazy adventure. I'd never even knew that was possible till I started to read about these big adventures. So it was the traditional big, tough, crazy adventurers, Captain Scott, Shackleton, Ranulph Fiennes, and then some long distance cyclists like Dervla Murphy and adventurers like Benedict Allen, who just got my brain starting to whir, thinking, ooh, there's some possibility here. So actually, because I looking back, I feel a bit sad that I didn't know about adventurers when I was really young. So I've since written a book about my childhood about my adventure heroes aimed at young kids, because I'd like to try and encourage more little kids to at least dream of travel and adventure, if only because it's far more achievable than being a professional soccer player.
So a final question, perhaps if you can, Alastair. You mentioned childhood heroes, then writing adventures for kids. But how do your adventurous experience have an effect on the way you educate your children? What are the life lessons that you give them based on the adventures that you've lived through?
I think the main thing I'm trying to make them realize is how much choice they have. They are lucky kids, as I'm a lucky man in a free country. They have so much choice and opportunity, and I don't really care what direction they go in life, as long as they've really thought about it and chosen it. I don't want them to think, oh, I can't do that, without even trying, and I don't want them to think, oh, people like me must do this, and just follow the rest of the crowd. So I want them to choose carefully before making the decision, and to not write themselves out of something before they've even tried it.
I think on that note, I'd like to thank you, Alastair, for your time, and everyone on the call for joining today. I really enjoyed the stories that you shared and the insights, and fantastic questions from the people joining. We will send some follow-up information for all of you to further immerse you in adventurous thinking and perhaps learn a little bit more about what Alastair is up to. For now, thank you very much. Stay healthy and safe, and thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.